This video is going to be a little different. I am so sick of seeing unthought out parse requirements for various teams and content, and of watching people halt their progression because they don't understand the function of the 21mm dummy. Consider this video an educational rant about the parse dummy, parsing in general, and how to actually use this super important tool to learn how to get better at ESO. Let's start by talking about what this thing actually is and what it's good for. Maybe one of the most common misconceptions that I hear is that the dummy can in any way measure the damage that you deal in content. This one's mainly for my console friends, but let me tell you, even on console, the dummy isn't even our best way to measure the damage that we're actually doing. Let's break this down by first diving into some logs. Whatever number you hit on a dummy, 100, 120, 140k, this number is something that you will never ever see replicated in a log. It's my biggest pet peeve when people try to say that a trial or fight only requires like 60k DPS and they're hitting 90 or 100k on a dummy. It just makes zero sense. In fights that are super short and bursty like the Spider in VHOF or the Snake in VRG, players are dealing 200k plus single target. But then you have fights like Yolnacrin in Sunspire where a phenomenal parse is around 110 to 115k, and any fight in between will just vary significantly in terms of what a good damage number is. So what's with all the discrepancies? Well, a fight that's 12 seconds like the Snake in VRG doesn't have any downtime for you recasting dots, AoEs, or your ultimate. None of these abilities need reapplied, and none of them will run out, so you get to have your damage measured with all sources of damage active without seeing that number go down when you inevitably would have to reapply something or while you're waiting for your ultimate to come back. It's raw burst. A fight like Yoln, though, has 30-second phases where you cannot damage the boss at all. The log will measure your damage done over the course of an entire fight, and if you can't do damage to a target because they're not there, that number goes down. So a parse that's 110k on Yoln probably starts at well over 150k before the dragon flies into the air. To tell someone, though, that they only need to do 100k for Yoln, and then they come in with their 100k dummy parse and actually do 50 to 60k, it's misleading and it shows a lack of understanding in the game. And maybe the most obvious reason the 21mm can't give you real damage potential, there's no mechanics happening while you parse. And no, I'm not talking about basic mechanics that you're expected to perform while doing damage, like anything that might make you move, block, or dodge. None of these things should lose you any damage if you're playing well. I mean mechanics that literally prevent you from hitting the boss, like when the dragons fly into the air in Sunspire, or when Olms goes gold bar in Vass. In addition to this, the 21mm doesn't even give you all of your raid buffs anymore. Damage from good raid comps in content produce DPS values way higher than anything that you can hit on the dummy right now. You cannot correlate any sort of damage on the dummy with any sort of damage in content. So then what's the point of the 21mm? Why bother parsing or having any parse requirements at all? Because there are good reasons to have them. The 21mm measures your basic understanding of a class and how dealing damage in ESO works. The unfortunate truth is that if you can't even master, say, the Dragon Knight rotation, in the most simple of settings, there's absolutely no chance that you're going to do good damage with the Dragon Knight in content. It's just not possible. Again, I'm sorry to sound harsh, but you're shooting yourself in the foot and preventing yourself from progressing and getting better with that kind of mentality, right? Like if you're hitting 100k on the dummy and there are players out there that are hitting over 140k, you're missing something, and that's okay. That is what the dummy is for. The dummy is its own progression that a player only ever has to go through one time if they want to, and they only ever have to do it on one class in their entire ESO career. Truly, if you can max out your damage on one single class, you will max all 7 of them, and even all 14 specs. What the dummy actually teaches you are the fundamentals of doing damage in ESO and the fundamentals of a class. When parsing on the 21mm, your goal is not to hit a number, it's to improve your damage. It sounds simple, but whatever the best players in the world are hitting, you are comparing yourself to that. The highest stat mark parse that I've seen in update 44 is about 130k, so whenever you parse on a stat mark, you're measuring how well you know the class and how well you understand core damage dealing mechanics by seeing how close you can get to 130k. This feels impossible for so many people, but I'm here to tell you that you're making it way harder than it needs to be. There are only 4 possible reasons that your damage is lower. It's either your build, rotation, weaving, or crit RNG. It's that simple. When I'm trying to measure my understanding of a class or a new setup, I try to be consistently hitting within 3 to 5k of these top parses. So if the highest stat mark parse I've seen is 130k, if I'm hitting over 125, 9 out of 10 parses, chances are I'm just waiting to get really good crit RNG for that pretty 130. Generically, I'm probably averaging 127. Maybe I had a bad crit parse of 126 and another really good crit parse of 129 in that window. These players hit these insane numbers because their fundamentals are so strong and consistent that they can do the exact same parse for hours and hours and hours until the game blesses them with the crits that they need to hit their YouTube thumbnail. Okay, but that's only 5K. What about the players who are at even 100K? What if I told you that I can almost always guess what your problem is on the 21 mil dummy just based on whatever that number is? It's usually true to say that a player hitting 120K on average in this example probably has their build squared away. Their rotation is probably pretty good, but their weaving is likely a little slow with maybe a bad skill decision here or there. In fact, it's kind of this last 5K that was by far the hardest part for me. Learning how to weave well on console is so incredibly difficult, by far the most difficult damage dealing element for us console players. I'll probably make a video on how to weave soon actually, but for players that are maybe 10 to 15K off of this goal, their build is probably most of the way, if not all of the way there, but their rotation probably isn't super clean and has a bit of room for improvement in addition to some weaving issues as well. Players 20 to 30K or more off of this are probably having issues with their rotation, weaving, and their build probably isn't all the way there either. And for players more than that off, they're probably missing something super fundamental, such as our always be casting rule. Then maybe my other biggest pet peeve for these reasons is when players are forced to parse in buff sets. What in the world does this do for you? Take, for example, somebody parsing on the 21 mil in Zenkosh. You can't even measure your raid damage, and you're preventing yourself from being able to know whether or not you understand the DK rotation by nuking the damage potential of your build. So now you just don't know if you're doing well or not. You can't even practice the hardest part of that build, maintaining Alkosh, because the dummy gives you only one synergy. Sure, the dummy is absolutely perfect to use to practice maybe a new setup that you're unfamiliar with, especially if you're using static rotations. But here's the deal, if you can hit 130K on the DK, you're doing so only with the dynamic rotation, so it won't matter what skills are on your bar. You might as well just practice the DK so that you can at least have some sort of measurement of success. So this is kind of where I'll start to transition into discussing parse requirements for rating. But in general, if I'm looking at your dummy number, I don't care that you're hitting 100K on the 21 mil and that the content only requires 90K DPS, for example, to clear. The dummy does not measure raid damage. It measures players' skill and understanding. If you're hitting 100K, what that tells me is that you're probably struggling to some degree with all four of the issues that I mentioned. Your build is probably missing maybe a set, upgrades, maybe you're missing CP, but your rotation probably isn't perfect either, and your weaving likely has room for improvement as well. And that's totally okay. We've all gone through this type of progression. But I probably wouldn't bring a player in that's hitting 100K into a DSR trifecta prog, for example. Even though 100K DPS, if you look at a log, is probably enough to clear all of these fights, because what this suggests is somebody who's not quite ready for some of the most difficult progressions in the game. And you know, to be fair, this usually isn't an issue. Most players do just fine when it comes to judging their own capabilities for these types of things. In fact, in my experience, people don't give themselves enough credit most of the time. However, I also don't think that recruiting players to your team based on some sort of dummy requirement is good for anybody, including the team recruiting. For content this difficult, it's lazy raid leading. I personally have not had any damage requirements for any of my teams in over 2 or 3 years, and over the last 3 years, I've done every single trifecta at least 3 times to get all of the trifectas done as tank, healer, and DD. This isn't just my philosophy though. Over all of those progressions, I only raid led probably 90% of them. And in the 10% that I didn't raid lead, including all of my recent records, none of those raid leads ever posted damage requirements either. To be fair, at that high level, it's kind of expected that you should be able to max your class. But way more importantly, how the heck do we pick players then? I look at VODs and logs. I think logs are a pretty obvious tool for PC players, so for my console friends, I'm mainly going to discuss the VOD side of things. But all of this is applicable to log reading as well. A good raid lead understands how to look for the fundamentals that would be exhibited on the 21 mil, as well as assess a player's ability to adapt that rotation for whatever the content may demand. In high level raiding, it's the way that you change your rotation to increase your damage in in real content scenarios that we're looking for. For example, when I'm looking at a fight like the twins in Dreadsail, I'm not only looking for a basic rotation to be maintained well when nothing is really happening, I'm looking to see how this player prepares their damage for specific mech phases. Does the player only use their spammable just before the boss ports away? How does the player prepare their damage for the rune mechanic? Does the player pay attention to health percentages? Are they reapplying dots when they're about to switch targets instead of spamming? And I've even begun recently looking at how fast players are weaving by tracking their casts versus the timers on their ability bar. In addition to this, VODs will also let you see how good of an understanding a player has with mechanics. Are they paying attention to the spawn location for ports? How do they prepare themselves to handle runes? Do they ever pick up a bubble, and how's their positioning what they do, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. For the most difficult progressions in the game, I do not care about your 21 mil parse. I assume that it's maxed. This philosophy really only works for super high-end raid teams though. The value of parse requirements for, say, a pug run out of your guild is necessary to attempt to gauge a player's understanding in basic game fundamentals in some sort of generic, standardized way. I see the value in parse requirements for guilds who organize events in mass and just kind of let everyone sign up, but I have to be clear, every single guild, player, and team's goal should be to eventually move away from these. Parse requirements are totally fine for newer teams who don't have raid leads or even anyone else on the team who understands the game well enough to read a log or look at a VOD and know what to look for. This, like any other skill in the game, takes a lot of practice. I don't expect a team who is starting their very first trifecta in TTT to have no parse requirements, but once they get to maybe PB or Swash, I would hope that they have learned how to do research in the game, that they know how to look at good POVs and compare them to their own players in their tryouts, and that this becomes the default. I mean, even in my training runs, I never once had a parse requirement, but I didn't have to because I'm a well-experienced enough player and raid lead to be able to explain to people how I want them to do damage in the moment, and then I can also watch and see if they're doing those things correctly in real time and make adjustments as needed to ensure the success of the run. Newer guilds obviously can't do this yet, and so parse requirements become more necessary as a standardization. So the TLDR of this entire video, the dummy is not useful for measuring raid damage. Saying that a raid requires 60k DPS and that you're doing 70 or 80k on a dummy makes absolutely no sense. You're assigning arbitrary numbers to values that don't exist. What the dummy actually measures is your mastery and understanding of dealing damage at the most fundamental level. I can tell how well you understand your class and how well you understand how damage dealing works in general by that 21 mil number that you hit. You figure this out by comparing yourself with the exact same build to whatever the highest parse you can find on YouTube is. Every class is different. The Arc struggles to get 130k, but the Sorc, for example, can get to nearly 150k this patch. So hitting 100k on the Arc is way different than hitting 100k on the Sorc. Measure your mastery by seeing how you compare to the best players in the game, shooting to be within 3 to 5k DPS for absolute mastery, and this accounts for the crit RNG that these YouTubers farm, and by understanding that you can usually figure out what the problem is by knowing how far away you are from that max potential. Even though this arbitrary 21 mil value will not tell you anything about a player's ability to do a raid well, parse requirements are necessary for newer teams and for younger guilds that do pug and gear runs so that there is an easy and standard way to gauge a player's fundamental understanding of doing damage in ESO. However, there are so many reasons that this is not very efficient, so if your goal as a raid lead is to eventually push the most difficult content in the game, you need to learn how to learn. You need to understand how to watch POVs from top level players in content that you're trying to progress, how to recognize what they do and why they do it, and then be able to look at VODs or logs for players trying out for your team to make a good decision about whether they're the right fit, instead of relying on a somewhat ambiguous and arbitrary number. Using parse requirements for getting into somewhat difficult but older content is a fine starting point, as long as you use it as a starting point. There ends the rant, but I want to know your thoughts. Have I given you a new perspective, or do you disagree? Let me know in the comments below. I'll take this time to let you know a couple of quick things though. If you are struggling to increase your parse or even your damage in content and you don't really know where to go, I do offer VOD and log review services over on Patreon. So if you don't want to do the endless research that it takes to figure it all out on your own, consider subscribing. Also, I do plan on making some videos in the very near future about the core concepts of damage dealing that will hopefully help. So make sure that you hit that bell and join the Discord so that you know when these videos go live. As always, hope you guys enjoyed the video and found it helpful. Thank you so much for all of your love and support. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next one.